My name is Sara. I'm a localization QA engineer for Italian language at Wargaming here in Prague. And on behalf of Wargaming, allow me to extend my warmest greeting to you all. This is my first talk here at 4C. Actually, it's my first talk ever. So I'm very passionate about localization QA. So I'm honored to be here, but I'm also a bit nervous. I worked hard on this presentation. I will do my best, but I hope you can be understanding if things are not perfect. So, welcome to this talk about localization QA and its role in delivering linguistic and cultural quality to our player. Today I would like to talk to you about three main aspects about this job. The first one is the difference between translation and localization QA. And in order to do that, I will explain what localization QA engineers do. Secondly, I would like to talk to you about quality. So how can we measure quality? Since we want to deliver quality to our players, and we have to be able to measure it. And lastly, since one of the targets of 4C conference is to take a view to the future, I would like to talk to you about machine learning and its role in delivering, in affecting our job. So, first of all, I would like to give you some background information about localization QA team. Currently, Wargaming supports many languages for localizations in Europe, in America, and in the Pacific area. In our Prague office, we support 6 languages: English, Polish, Turkish, Italian, French, and Czech. Other languages are supported in many other offices all around the world. For some languages, we have 2 localization QA engineers. For other, we have just 1. That depends on the number of products we have to translate and we have to localize, and also from the size of our players' community. So, people who are not familiar with localization QA think that localization QA engineers are a sort of translators, but that's definitely not true. That's not what we do. The first difference between translators and localization QA is a chronological difference. Translators work on the product at an earlier stage than we do. So first, translators translate or localize the text, and then localization QA engineers work on the text. So the first difference is chronological. But the most important difference, in my opinion, is that translators work on the text while we work on the product. So you may ask, what's the difference between the text and the product? This is the difference. So this is a text. It's already translated in Italian, and it's I'm sure most of you don't speak Italian, but I can assure you that this text is perfect. It's grammatically perfect. the translator did a great job. But this is the product. And as you can see, this grammatically perfect text doesn't work in the context. It has some problem. It's truncated. It doesn't fit the user interface. This is another example and has to do with grammar. So another perfect test, it's grammatically okay, but if we put this text into the product, the grammatical rules are not respected. The text is wrongly segmented. So this is the difference between text and product. So a text that is good is not enough to make a product that is good. So now I would like to explain you what localization QA engineers do and how they work both with text and with product. So the first task we have to perform, of course, is compare the source text and the translation. We have to be sure that the meaning of the translation is exactly the same as the meaning conveyed by the source text. Can be pretty obvious, but sometimes, believe me, it's not. So in the second instance, we have to proofread the translation to spot typos and other formal errors. We have to check that the text is grammatically correct, syntactically correct, that it has no typos. So in other words, we have to be sure that the form of the text is okay. And that's another common mistake. Most people believe that we just read our translation and look for typos and grammatical errors. It's partly true. That's part of what we do, but it's definitely not everything. So, third aspect of our job is ensure consistency. Consistency means that what has been previously translated in one way must be always translated in that way in similar context. Because players are familiar with certain terms, and we have to be sure that these terms are always present and the players get not confounded. We must ensure quality within the same text. For example, if we have an article regarding our last update, we must be sure that the same expressions in the article are always translated in the same way. But we must also ensure consistency in sets of text. For example, we must be sure that if there is a new mechanic, the name of the mechanic in the client and the name of the mechanic as described in the article is the same. And lastly, we must ensure consistency throughout the whole product, meaning that, of course, if there is a new update, it must be consistent with what is already in the game. Another level of our work is cultural appropriateness. With cultural appropriateness, we mean that what is perfectly understandable and clear in one language cannot be as understandable and clear in another cultural area. So, we must be sure that our text, that the content of our product is appropriate to the cultural area it's destined to. Then we polish style. It means that the text must not be only grammatically correct, but it must also sound good to the reader. It must have good style. It must not sound as translated, but it must sound as something specifically created for that audience in that cultural area. And later, I will make some example about cultural appropriateness and style. Lastly, and this is the most important aspect in my opinion, we have to check the product. So we have to check that our text works in the context, that it matches the visual context of the game, that it's what I showed you before. Not always a grammatically perfect text works in the game. So we have to be sure that the text is not only good, but it's work in the product with the visual context. So to give you a visual representation of the differences between translation and localization QA, I always use the wood carving metaphor. So imagine that you have to carve a piece of art out of a wood trunk. We could say that translators rough cut the wood. They give the statue or piece of art its general shape. And then, after that, localization QA comes into play, and it adds the small details. It polishes the piece of art, and it takes care about the smallest detail. So I think this is a good metaphor to explain what happens from translation to localization. The work of translators and the work of localization QA engineers has as its ultimate purpose to deliver linguistic and cultural quality to the players. But what is quality? And how can we measure quality? And that leads me to my next point. So, quality. What is quality? We could give many definitions of quality, more detailed explanations, but I chose this one. So quality is the ability to satisfy the expectations of players by anticipating them. In our work, we have to use two different approaches and to coordinate them. We must have an engineering approach and we must have a linguistic approach. As engineers, we must be able to measure quality, to count the errors. And actually some errors are pretty easy to count, and we can do it relatively easy. Look at this example. So in this example, a tank destroyer, which is a vehicle, became a destroyer in the Italian translation. So a vehicle became a ship. This is obviously an error because the meaning of the meaning conveyed by the translation is definitely not the same meaning conveyed by the original text. This is another example. In this example, you can see that the highlighted words. So, in the first case, in the original text, the players must the leaderboard of the players must be based on damage caused, while in the translation, the leaderboard is organized by earned experience. So you can imagine that this is pretty problematic for players. And this is even more problematic because even if you can't understand Italian, and I'm sure that most of you don't, you can see that there is a mistake because 20% discount became 22% discount. So this is particularly serious because this has to do with monetization. So not just in-game currency, but real money. So if we do a mistake like that, it's problematic not always for the players, but also for the company, of course. So we can easily measure this kind of errors. We can count, for example, how many grammatical errors or how many typos there are in one text. We can get a percentage, a ratio between the number of errors and the number of words in the text, or the number of errors and the number of strings in the text. But other mistakes are not so easily measured. Now I will show you one map. So this is what this map would probably look like in North Korea. This is what it would probably look like in South Korea. And finally, this is what it will probably look like in Japan. So, same map, same geographical area, but in North Korea, this sea is called East Sea of Korea. In South Korea, it's called East Sea. And finally, in Japan, it's called Sea of Japan. So, in order to achieve a good result, we must be aware of these differences. We must take into consideration the target market. Otherwise, we risk we risk creating a war, starting a war, and we don't want to do that. So this is what I mean with cultural appropriateness. Each content must be cultural appropriate to its specific target market. And finally, we have one further level concerning style and creativity. And I chose this text. We can consider it like a little poem because it has some rhyming, it has some puns. This is the Italian translation for this text. And again, I can assure you that this translation is grammatically perfect. But how can we say if this is a good translation? How can we establish if this is a good translation? Well, we can't. We can try to see if creativity of the source text is conveyed also in the translation, but in the end, our judgment is always subjective. Some players may think that this translation is brilliant. Some other players may think that it's not good enough. And we cannot measure that because it has to do with the perception of the text in a specific cultural area and in a specific community of players. So, in the end, we can say that as engineers, we can measure some kind of mistakes, but when it comes to style and creativity, actually, our linguistical sensibility must come into play, and we cannot measure that. Or if we want to measure that, we must be aware that our judgment is to some extent subjective. So, as I told you before, my last topic would be machine translation or machine-assisted translation and its impact on our work. So, with machine translation, we mean machine learning. That is using AI technologies in order to perform translation tasks. Google Translate. I'm sure that you are all familiar with Google Translate. This is an example of machine translation. Machine translation is growing more and more popular in companies recently because, of course, it allows companies to save time and money. And we must admit that machine translation tools are growing more and more accurate. So, of course, the question is almost obvious. Why don't we just automate? Why don't we just use machines in order to perform translation tasks? It saves money, saves time. Why don't we just do that? I prepared a little game for you. I actually enjoyed preparing it, and you can enjoy. You can try it at home. In the first square, you can see the description of our top game, World of Tanks, as you can find it on our website. So I took this translation. I used Google Translate in order to translate it into several languages, for example, Italian, Russian, Czech, and then back to English. And this is the result. We can say that the meaning is still clear. Somehow it has the same meaning. It says that in the game you can ride lots of different tanks, and there are a lot of players playing this game. But of course, the style is not appropriate. It's funny, there are some funny mistakes. It's not professional. I mean, a professional company could never use something like that on their website. So, if you remember what I told you before about the wood carving metaphor, I would like to come back to this metaphor. And personally, I think that machine translation can bring us that far. So it can help translators rough cut the wood. It can help them speed up their job. But at Wargaming, and I hope also in other professional big companies, we don't want that. We want that. And for that, human factor is still vital. You can do the core of the job with machine translation, maybe. But if you want to achieve a good result, the only way to do it so far is with human employees. So, to sum up, I've explained the differences between translation and localization QA, and I hope that now it's clear to you that localization QA engineers are definitely not translators, and they do a totally different job. Then we talked about quality, and we have seen that quality is partly measurable, partly subjective, and in the end, we have taken a quick view to the future, and we have seen the impact of machine learning on translation, and we have seen that human factor is still vital in this field. So I hope everything is clear. If you have any comment or question, please go on. I will be more than happy to answer any of your questions.
First of all, great presentation. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I have a question. You showed a little example of how the text in the localization doesn't fit into the product. My question is, how do you deal with that? Do you always rephrase? Do you shrink the font? What do you do?
That's a good question. It actually depends on the situation. We have several numbers of text. We have articles, we have game clients, we have banners, and we have several products. We have World of Tanks, we have World of Warship, we have we have several products. So it depends on the situation. In some cases, the only option is to rephrase. So we have to rephrase the text in order to fit the UI. In other cases, rephrase is not possible because, for example, when you have just 2 words and these 2 words are too long, you cannot find another way to say it. So you have to find a synonym, you have to find something that means not exactly what the original means, but fit the UI and still is understandable. In some cases, we ask the developer to adapt the UI, but most of time they answer, we cannot do that, please try to rephrase. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they just ask us to rephrase. So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you for the presentation, that was great. I have a question regarding fixing bugs. Do you fix bugs by yourself, or you are just creating them in Jira and assign to translator, or how do you deal with that?
The answer is, again, depends. Depends on the product, depends on what the product manager wants us to do. Most of time, we fix our bugs by ourselves, we submit the updated file, and somebody will update the client or the article. Other time, we cannot do that, so we must provide the original translation, the translation with our fixes, the comment, so why this bug needs to be fixed, and then somebody else will fix it. And there is another situation, and it's the situation of recurring errors. Sometimes translator always makes the same mistakes. In this case, the easiest way to do it is just fix the error, but when it happens the second time or the third time, you still fix it, but you send feedback to the translator and just discuss with him or her, and you basically point out the mistake. You can have a discussion with him, so he can have the possibility to explain why he did that. But in the end, we just find a solution directly with the translator. So.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello. Great presentation.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of issues that can occur when the translator takes the text and tries to translate it. Do you have some documents, design documents that you are providing them, maybe based on experience with the issues and stuff like that, that they are actually going to follow? For example, I don't know, for this specific thing, we need to limit 35, how do you call it?
Characters.
Yeah, characters, exactly, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, the number of characters is not up to us. It's decided by product manager, and that is also useful for UI, because sometimes if you have a limit of characters, it helps you fit your text in the UI. But generally, what we as localization QA engineers can provide to the translators, except for our feedback after the translation, is some sort of style guide. So we provide them with a style guide. So we say that with some style rules about, for example, capitalizations, about numbers. I mean, there are tons of aspects of the language that are not wrong, But if you make one choice, you have to stick with that choice. So we provide them with this kind of documents. Sometimes they comply to it, sometimes they don't. But the problem is that most of the time they don't have so much time. They have to work on a really tight schedule, so sometimes they just don't have time to look at our document or to pay attention to it. And another thing, when, for example, there is some big change in the game, for example, a totally new mechanics or totally new aspect of the game, we normally speak directly with the translator and we try to find a solution before they start the translation. Or after they translate, they contact us and they just tell us, I chose to translate this new mechanic in this way, why, they explain why, we give them our feedback and then we begin our proofreading. So depends on the situation, on the product, and on the product manager. We do what they want us to do. So
Thank you.
I guess that's all. No?
yeah.
Thank you for the information. It was very interesting. And my question would be like, what is the common background of localization QA engineer? Are you translators? Are you technical experts? Or what is the direction of translation background?
That's an interesting question. I said before that we have two approaches. One is engineering approach, the other one is linguistic approach. In my opinion, and it's just my opinion, linguistic approach is more important. So I would say that the background should be linguistic background, some experience in translation. Of course, some technical knowledge is useful, but I think that in our daily duties, we can easily understand technical aspects, while linguistic sensibility is something that you cannot just learn in 2 months or 2 years. It takes a lifetime to build linguistic sensibility. Of course, the better would be to be native speaker. I'm Italian. I'm localization QA for Italian. Because native speaker has a linguistic sensibility that, in my opinion, cannot be achieved in a lifetime of studying. So I would say experience in translation and be a native speaker.
Thank you.
That's all for today. Sara, thank you so much. Let's give Sara a round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here. It was my greatest pleasure.